All right, everyone, welcome back to the Psych and Theo podcast. We are back with another episode on politics and the purpose of government and a biblical worldview. I'm joined by my buddy Sam Landa over here. Sam, what are you munching on over there? You're eating something.
These delicious cookies, man. They're the ones you just buy from the store. Just put them in the oven, cook them. Thanks for bringing them.
Wow,
It's delicious.
it's like I told you to say that when I asked you. Yeah. Sam, I brought some cookies to give us a little bit of motivation as we're recording here.
I'm gonna be hyped now.
Those of you who may not know this, when we record these episodes, we usually record 2 or 3 at a time. So we do these long recording sessions, and we need to pick me up, in between episodes.
We just don't do coffee as much. We did start coffee. Oh, yeah. I have to share this because I was thinking about it.
Oh,
today.
okay.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
Remember when we first were thinking about a name for our podcast?
Oh, yeah.
So I think we're going to show you guys on our page or something what our original name was going to be. It was going to be the 3C podcast. I don't know if we've mentioned that before, but I'm going to show you guys the logo so you can see what horrendous work we were doing first.
Man, that was actually my idea.
Is it for the 3C?
Yeah, that was because we were like, what if we did like coffee, and we were always talking about coffee at the beginning of every episode. And it was like coffee, culture, and Christianity.
That's
so
exactly.
The 3Cs. It sounded so good at the time. I've had some good ideas along the way in my life, but that's not one of them.
Yeah, my color scheme thing on that was way off though. Red and yellow and something else. I like what we ended up with.
Looked like the Flash.
Yes, it did. Yeah. We'll have to show you guys tomorrow, but yeah.
All right. So can I tell you a story about these cookies though?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I want to tell you, one time I almost won a baking competition with break and bake cookies. And it wasn't like I was cheating or like I was being dishonest. Okay. This was at work many, many years ago. Work decided every Friday we would do this thing where everyone brings a food item in. It's the same food item, but of different varieties. And this one week was just about cookies. Everyone bring in your favorite cookie. Okay. Or just bring in cookies. I'll bring in all different types of cookies. And people are like peanut butter, chocolate chip, oatmeal, all that stuff. And like, okay, like I'll just get some break and bake cookies. No big deal. Like, like chocolate chip or something, like it's no big deal. Like we're just all bringing in different types of cookies. And I'm a guy who cares? You expect anything less or more from me? So that's my plan. Well, midway through the week, it morphed into this competition. People were like in the chat, the team's chat about this, and they're going on about like, oh, I'm doing this cookie, and it turned into this whole competition. So everyone's like, I'm bringing my cookies, my mama's cookies, And so I'm like, well, I'll just bring my cookies for people to enjoy. Okay. Not my cookies, like Toll House break and bake cookies, man. Right. Okay. And so the day comes, Friday comes, and we all bring our cookies and we all put them, on the table. And, people start taste testing the cookies, and they all they like one after the other is commenting on, wow, how these my cookies, like, wow, they're so perfect. They're so round, like so perfect circles, and like they're so soft, and like the flavor is just so rich. And I'm just sitting there like, they honestly think I made these cookies from scratch. Like one dude went all out. He made his own personal ice cream and everything. And so like people went all out on this. I'm like, so I toward the end of I was like, I think I would have gotten second. Yeah. Had I not said anything. Like the points were getting racked up, and I'm like, oh gosh, I'm in second place. I better say something. So I just started laughing. They're like, what are you laughing? I'm like, God, I broke the news to him. Yeah. And then there was just this indignation all around about how could I have brought bake and break cookies to this competition. And I'm like, you guys, it didn't start out as a competition. It was just a time of bringing cookies together.
Yeah. Were you the only one who did that?
Yeah.
Everyone baked their own cookies?
Yeah, but that was because it turned into a competition.
Oh my gosh, that's
so I'm like, I didn't feel any guilt over it. I'm like, look, you guys changed the rules of the game here.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, I had no idea that break and bake cookies were that superior to everyone's homemade cookies, but Apparently they are.
Yeah. Did you like anyone else's cookies more than the ones that you brought?
I don't remember. Yeah.
That would have been funny.
Now I could make some cookies nowadays that would rival or surpass Break and Bakes.
Okay.
But
cool.
Break and Bakes are good.
They are good. They are good.
Okay.
Thank you for sharing that.
All right. So let's get into the episode. The first part one of this, we did the purpose of government, and I explained that there was a primary function and a secondary function. The primary function, and we got this from Romans 13. The primary function is the restraint on evil, the punishment of evil, the restraining evil via punishment. And then the secondary function is the promotion of good via the punishment of evil. So the secondary function flows from the primary function. Government promoting good is only possible when government properly restrains evil. And so those two functions they're not equal themselves. One is inferior to the other. So government is an entity it has a negative function in society. It's an entity that instills fear in people to do the right thing, not to commit violence against people, not to defraud people, not to assault people, things like that. And when it does that well, then society can function and flourish, and people can live. Yeah. And therefore do good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you gave all the context behind Romans 13.
Yeah.
Right. But you were saying about the questions?
Oh, you had
you had so many questions.
Yeah, you had follow-up questions. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's get into it.
I feel like people would have these questions as well. And so let's get into these questions that were coming up for me, Tim. And I think a lot of people will have these questions. One of the biggest ones was, okay, so now that we understand what the role of government was at that time, then I was starting to think, okay, does that still apply today? And it does. So what does that mean? So how should Christians then engage the political process and conversation that we have today? Because obviously right now we have two candidates who are trying to, get our vote, and they're promoting certain policies. We know where we stand on issues. We know where we're voting or who we're voting for. But with that, how should Christians engage this process, considering the information you give us about Romans 13 and the cultural background there?
Well, so the implication of Romans 13 is that governments have a limited role in society. Governments are not the same thing as society. So that would tell you that's one thing. Society is people relating to one another, doing commerce with one another, going to church with one another, all those things that in society we do without the threat of violence. Okay. The government has a role to play in preserving order in society, but it's not the same thing as society. The government doesn't define human society, or the government is not the, let's say, the progenitor of human society. It doesn't create human society. Human societies create governments. This is the main thesis of the Declaration of Independence, is that governments actually derive their power from the consent of the governed. When a government no longer has the consent of those who it governs, it actually forfeits its right to rule. Because there was a debate at that time that the English kings would they appealed to this, what was called the divine right of kings, that this divine authority, and they would use Romans 13 for this, that since the authority is of the government is given to them by God, then authority is passed down from king to king to king, and that is their divine right to rule. Well, I mean, the founders of our country were a mix. A couple of them were deists, but most of them were Christians, and they knew their Bible too. Yeah. And they said, no, like, governments have a specific limited function. And when they fail in that function, they forfeit their right to rule. And so the people themselves have the authority to reconstitute that government, to reshape it, to reform it in some way. People are not doomed to live under tyranny their entire lives. Yeah. They have a moral authority as image bearers to stand up and say, no, government, you are wrong. This is wrong. You need to change. And if enough of the people do that, change will be possible. Okay.
And that's only within our government system, not other governments around the world. Or is
no, that's a universal truth.
Okay.
Now, that doesn't mean that it's practical all the time.
Okay.
If you need enough people to basically stand up to a totalitarian government and say, no, we're not going to go any further than this. There's a really old German proverb that I really like. I learned this in my German class going through PhD work. But it says there's three things that can't be stopped: fire, the flood, and the crowd. And if the crowd is big enough, it can't really be stopped.
Yeah.
So anyway, just as a principle, the founders of our country in America were saying that governments, they have their authority. Like our rights come from God. Like all human beings have innate natural rights, and that comes from God too. And so governments are instituted by men to uphold these laws, these fundamental rights and laws. And when they don't do that, they are not fulfilling their function. And so the image bearers of God have a duty to reconstitute and reform that government.
It's good.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, practically, like that's not always possible in a practical sense, but in a moral sense, is what the founders of our country were saying.
Yeah.
Okay. So I may be getting off on your question a little bit, but I think you said, how should we engage?
As Christians engage?
So the implication in Romans 13 is that there's a limit. The government has limits. And when we see the government exceeding those limits, we have a moral duty in some way to address that. How we go about addressing it, to what extent we address it, can all be up for debate. But we have a moral duty to at least address it in some way when the government is exceeding those boundaries, either exceeding the boundaries of the scope of its authority or negating its authority, like abdicating its authority to punish evil, as we see in some states around the country.
Yeah.
Okay. So in either case, when the government is not fulfilling its role or it's exceeding its role, people, not just Christians, this is a universal moral duty. People have a duty to say, no, like that's not your role. That's not your function. The scriptures inform us of that. So as Christians, we can say, look, we help people understand what that role of government is. Okay. That's sort of our role in society, is to help governments understand their role, help other people, hopefully, as we witness to them, to understand this is the role of government. When a government does this properly, it's actually really good. Hey, and guess what? How we know that? God tells us.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a limit. So we, in our society, we have the privilege, we have the opportunity to voice that consent or dissent. In either case, we can do it through media, or we can do it through the ballot box.
Yep.
Or in extreme cases, we can do that through withdrawal. You know, and we get into arguments about like when it's time to secede from the union and all that stuff. You know, because that's a debate that's coming up these days. But so you can either protest, you could vote, you can argue, or you can just withdraw.
Yeah.
You know, those are kind of the four main ones.
Yeah. Yeah, I think when you were talking in the last one about the role of government being to punish evil and then also to promote the good, one of the other questions that came up for me was, well, what about the things that the government promotes that they're saying are good, but are not good because it goes against the teachings of Scripture? And I think that's what Christians are going to look at. They're going to say, well, the government is trying to push this on us, or is using our tax dollars for this. That's not good, or goes against our beliefs as Christians. What do we do there? Right? What happens in that situation? How should Christians respond to issues or laws that are being passed that contradict biblical teachings?
Yeah. So this is where Christians need to be careful. Okay. Because the government is not the church. So we can't expect the government to institute morality, all forms of Christian morality. However, we can expect the government to institute basic forms of morality that are apparent in nature, okay, that we can deduce through reasoning and natural law. So this is why it's important for Christians to understand the kind of arguments that they're making in the public square. If you're trying to make arguments that are biblical, but you're just quoting the Bible and someone doesn't recognize the Bible as authority, they're just going to say, well, you're just a Christian nut job. And I'm not going to listen to you. But if you could make arguments that are biblical, but don't rely necessarily on biblical references, I think they're going to be much more persuasive. So when we deal with issues like transgenderism, let's say, we can make rational arguments that we would say are rooted in natural law, but rooted in the created order that God made, that all image bearers have the capacity to recognize, have the moral duty to recognize, I would say. We can make arguments to that effect. There was a book I referenced a long time ago in that very first episode on transgenderism. The book is called When Harry Met Sally.
Oh, yeah.
By Ryan T. Anderson. That's a perfect example of making natural law arguments in the public square. Natural law arguments that are thoroughly biblical. It just doesn't rely on biblical references. Okay. So the Bible does inform us of basic morality and even Christian morality. Not that those two things are always distinct, but the life of the church and how Christians are expected to live as sanctified people of God. The government, its role is primarily a negative role. It can do things that Christians can't do, namely kill people. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we need to be advising the government on the wise, prudent, righteous way to do that. Okay. So I think that's when I don't know if I'm answering your question enough.
How should we respond to it? So it sounds like from what you're saying is that we can respond with logical, cohesive arguments and not necessarily have to reference scripture, because it'll make listeners maybe, not want to listen or just be more resistant to what we're trying to.
Yeah. And rest assured, all truth is God's truth. Okay. And God created the world. He created the moral order of the universe. Okay. And people can only violate that natural moral order so long before nature bites back.
Yeah.
So just rest assured, just because we're not quoting the Bible doesn't mean that we've neglected biblical authority, or that people won't get it, because all human beings are created in the image of God. And all human beings, even if they're not Christians, have a basic sense of morality. They at least their conscience bears witness against them. They at least know right from wrong in a basic sense. Now that can be darkened and other things. And so we need the help of the Holy Spirit to illuminate people's minds and hearts. But there's a very, I would say a very spirited, robust debate within Christian circles, especially Protestant circles, on the role of natural law, that even with a sense of like total depravity, that human beings, even their mind is affected by sin, they still understand basic forms of morality that are given to them in creation. And this is Paul's argument in Romans 1 when dealing with the issue of idolatry and homosexuality.
Yeah.
So when a government is exceeding its authority, let's say, or it's calling good evil and evil good, that is when I think Christians, more than anyone else, have a responsibility to speak up and say, no, like good is good, evil is evil. Now, how we do that? We need to do that with patience, with grace, with accuracy. But we need to do that. Okay.
Yeah. One of the things that makes it challenging, I think, as I was thinking about that right now, is that we have people who are who call themselves Christians, but are advocating for things that are evil. And because those same people elect people who are promoting the same thing. So we're kind of at this very interesting point in history. I mean, I'm assuming it's always been like this, but yeah, it's very interesting because it's causing more division even within churches, which brings up another question is, should the church be involved in politics, or should they just be committed to, hey, our job as a church, and you mentioned this in the last episode, is to preach the gospel and, and have people accept Christ, right? So that's to disciple the nations, right? But because politics is such a huge part of people's, I don't know if identity or representation of their beliefs, there's always going to be a tie to it. So pastors, churches, they find different ways to get involved. should they? Or should they just stick with the Bible and the gospel, and that is the only thing they should be teaching in their churches?
Yeah, that's certainly the approach of some people, but I think it's incorrect.
Just to go all Bible and gospel?
Yeah, and totally avoid politics altogether.
Okay.
I think that reaction is based on some bad examples we've seen where people over politicize things in church, and it runs people away. But I think it's an oversimplification of our duty to society as Christians. Now, our primary function is to spread the gospel and to preach. That is absolutely our primary function. That is but to say that our primary function is our sole function is again a bit of a simplified reading of the scriptures. Let me give you an example of this. Some people will go to Romans 13 or 1 Peter 2, and they will say, look, see, Christians are just to obey the government, pay their taxes. We're to live quiet and peaceful lives. That's from 1 Thessalonians. And we were to work with our hands, 1 Thessalonians, and I think it's 1 Thessalonians, maybe 2nd. But we're to be basically peaceful, quiet citizens, go about our lives, and we preach the gospel. We don't get involved in politics because the early Christians didn't get involved in politics. Okay, we don't see that in the New Testament. Paul didn't try to overturn slavery or anything like that. So they typically will make these kind of arguments. Yeah. The problem is you have to understand these things in context. The Christian church is not in a position to change anything in the Roman Empire. They are spreading the gospel. Like they're trying to spread the gospel throughout the whole world. Okay. They are not in any sort of position of political power to enact any change whatsoever. It would be completely reckless, maybe suicidal for Christians to try to do that when they're this small fledgling group of people that largely the Roman Empire looks at as a Jewish sect. For them to come around and be like, all right, we're in charge now. Like no more slavery. There was a lot of slavery was the economy of the Roman Empire. Okay. If Paul comes out and is like, okay, like no more slaves, guys. Slaves, disobey your masters. You're a Christian now. There's neither slave nor Greek. So don't worry about it. What that's going to do in the Roman Empire, that's going to bring down the whole Roman Empire on Christians. So Paul has that in mind. Okay. Now Paul says in the church, hey, there's neither, when you come together as a body of believers, there's neither, you are to act as though there's neither slave nor free. Okay. Now, getting back to modern society, people will read into the New Testament and they'll say, look, New Testament Christians, they're not doing any social activism. Neither should we. But again, they're not in a position to do so. In fact, for the first 3 centuries of the church, they weren't in a position to do that. Now, the church fathers were writing about some things. They were writing to the emperors and trying to influence them. Hey, Christians, we're good. We're trying to promote the empire. We're praying for the empire. We're actually good citizens. Please don't persecute us. Okay. But it wasn't until Constantine comes to power and the Edict of Milan in 313 AD is when essentially all Christian persecution ends. Christianity becomes the legal, and Constantine converts to Christianity, and Christianity almost immediately sweeps into power in the Roman Empire. And Constantine starts asking the bishops for advice. Okay. So imagine you go from 0 to hero overnight. Right. Okay. You're a bishop of a prominent church in the Roman Empire. And all of a sudden the emperor of Rome is like, all right, I'm a Christian now. And he gets baptized. And he's like, all right, everyone stop persecuting Christians. In fact, you Christians, come over here to Rome and advise me. All right. Wow. If you're a Christian at this time, now you're thrust into a situation where you have to start thinking a little differently. You now have to start thinking about, how do we advise the Roman government? Because before this time, it was pagan. It was evil. It was opposing Christianity. So there were debates before Constantine came to power of whether Christians should serve in the military, because the Roman military was enacting the will of a pagan empire. Interesting. Going around conquering lands. If you were a Christian, could you actually do that? And so there was debates about this in the early church. When they come to power and Rome becomes officially Christian, well, then that changes the nature of the debate, doesn't it? Now Christians have to start asking the question of, when is violence justified?
Yeah.
Like, so that's when you see the first instances of just war theory coming about with Augustine, which is about a century later.
Mm-hmm.
But Christians have to start answering these questions. I say all that to say this. In our modern society, we find ourselves in a situation that's qualitatively different than the first century or the first 3 centuries.
Yeah.
We are not subjects of a tyrannical emperor that's going around killing Christians. We're not even Christians of a Christian empire. We're Christians in a democratic society where we vote to determine not just the people who lead us, but what they say and what they do.
Mm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's a qualitatively different situation. So just because the New Testament Christians weren't social activists, just because they weren't talking about politics and how to influence the government doesn't mean that we can't or ought not to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, when it comes to church, what is the place of politics in the church? Well, if you're using your pulpit as a partisan billy club
Mm-hmm.
to endorse your candidates, well, actually, that's illegal in our country right now, is to endorse candidates from the pulpit. It wasn't always illegal.
I know. I was just going to ask about that.
Yeah, it's the Johnson Amendment, which I think is unconstitutional, in my own opinion.
Mm-hmm.
I think
freedom of speech.
I'm curious if it's going to get overturned, the Johnson Amendment, eventually.
It would be interesting.
Yeah. So if you're using the pulpit to be a partisan politicker and say that, well, my candidate's the best and blah, 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 and you're driving people away from hearing the gospel, you're missing the point and you're misusing your office. However, if you're teaching people what the proper role of a government is and using wisdom to discern good leaders from bad leaders, that's a legitimate function of a pastor or the elders of a church, to disciple people in the wisdom of how to influence their society for good.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. Now we can't get into the practicalities of that, but in principle, you're pastors who are listening, or lay people, maybe you're listening and you want to talk to your pastor about this. Like, the pastor has a responsibility to disciple people in the ways of godliness. And as Christians, we find ourselves in a situation where even outsiders expect us to have some sort of opinion on the direction of our country. They sometimes look to us and say, well, what do you guys think? Okay. Like, if the president were to call you up, pastor, and ask your opinion about something, what would you say to him?
Yeah.
That is essentially what the Christians found themselves in Constantine's era. But we don't have that situation where the president may not be calling you up, but you have a right to vote. And that right to vote is a privilege to exercise at least a little bit of influence in society to try to push it in the right direction. If you know the purpose of government and the roles of government, the limited role of government, and you see society moving away from that and promoting a government that wants to call evil good and good evil.
Right.
A government that wants to institute economic policies that are crazy, or really unjust. You have a responsibility to vote, to try to influence that in some way, shape, or form.
It's good. It's good.
Yeah.
To kind of close this out. So what do we say to Christians who are not voting? And we saw this a lot in the last election, where a lot of Christians have decided not to be a part of the process, where they say, well, I'm choosing the lesser of two evils, and it's better just not to vote. And so there's this disengagement from the process when we have the privilege and we have the freedom and the ability to put someone as a leader for our country. So what do we say to those who decide not to? Is it wrong, or is it a sin for them not to be engaged in the process?
Let me clarify what I said earlier. When I said you have a responsibility to vote, you don't necessarily have a responsibility or a duty to vote, but you do have a responsibility to influence society in the right direction. Voting, I think, is a matter of conscience. Okay. Not that any candidate is of equal moral standing. Okay. But I don't put on people this burden of you have to vote. Okay. I think whether you choose to vote or not is a matter of conscience. However, if you don't want to vote, usually it's because they're like, my conscience doesn't allow me to endorse either of these candidates, to give my voice to them. So I just won't give my voice to any of them. That in and of itself is an act of a political act in and of itself. Usually those people are pretty vocal about that, and that's, I think, perfectly legitimate. for Christians to do is to say, hey, I actually think our country's headed in a disastrous direction, and neither of these people are going to fix it. So we actually need to move in a different direction. This is a mistake. So I don't think that a Christian has the duty to vote for the lesser of two evils. Some Christians think it's morally prudent to vote for the lesser of two evils because politics is a business of compromising. You don't always get what you want. And one candidate is clearly going to be more favorable to evangelical Christianity, let's say, than the other one. There's also one party that's definitely not perfect and definitely has a lot of problems, but is not engaging in outright evil that we would see in the other party. So I don't want to give voice to this idea that the Republicans and the Democrats in our country are of moral equivalency. I don't think that at all. It just says some cultures can be way far away from biblical morality and the morality of the created order. I think some political parties can be just totally like off their rocker and gone. I think in my opinion, I don't mean I'm not endorsing the Republicans here. I'm not endorsing Trump, but the Democratic Party at least is engaged. I mean, it's not the same Democratic Party of even 30 years ago, 40 years ago. I mean, they are outright engaged and endorsing things that are, I mean, just evil. Like promoting transgender ideologies for children. And
outside the parents.
They had an abortion clinic right outside the DNC this year. First time ever.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, these kinds of things, if you have spiritual eyes to see this, you understand the demonic nature of these things. There is no moral equivalency to be drawn between that and whatever foibles the Republicans find themselves in. These are not morally equivalent things. So it's really lazy and sometimes dishonest for people to draw that moral equivalency. It's not that you can't have objections to what the Republicans put up or who their candidates are, but to draw a moral equivalency, I think, is really lazy and or just dishonest, disingenuous.
Absolutely.
So I'm probably going to get labeled as some partisan there, but
right. And I will share this just because I don't know if I'm going to touch it on the next episode, but one of the things that you don't want to do. So obviously right now we talked about, okay, what's the Christian's role in the process? Does a Christian have a duty to vote or not vote and so on? But one thing that I will push back against is this idea that you can be a Christian, or that as a Christian, you're going to be advocating for things that are immoral. And the clearest example of that is, a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago, Steph Curry, very well-known basketball player, very popular, when he was asked, who are you voting for in this election? And he said who he was voting for. And he said the primary reason, okay, and he has professed it very openly that he's a Christian, but very openly he also says the reason why I'm voting for this person is because they are going to give women choice, obviously referring to the choice to having an abortion. So those are clear things that you see. You're like, how do you reconcile those two things? You can't, right? And there's many examples of people who have cultural influence and who would say, hey, I'm a Christian and I'm voting for this person for this specific reason. So things that are immoral, things that you mentioned right now in the podcast, things that we know go against scripture, like those things, they just do not align. So I'll always push back against those things.
Here's how they rationalize it. I want to steel man their argument and then we can knock it down. They will rationalize something like abortion by saying, like someone like Steph Curry, who claims to be an evangelical Christian, and he's like, I'm endorsing Kamala because the right of women is like the primary reason for this. Okay. Here's how they rationalize it usually is that they'll say, I'm personally pro-life.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
But I don't think that the government has any right over a woman's body. Now, if you have listened to our abortion episodes, you know how fallacious that argument is. Okay. But let's just take this back to Romans 13 for a minute. Yeah, and we're asking the question whether abortion falls under the purview of the government or not. Well, we have to ask ourselves what abortion is. If abortion is the intentional, violent terminating of an unborn life in the womb, a human being in the womb. If we as Christians believe that that is a human being, therefore it's an image bearer. Mm-hmm. Okay, therefore it has a right to life. Or another way to put it, no other human being has a right to take that innocent life. Only governments have the right to take life, and it's not innocent life they have the right to take. They have authority to take the life of evil doers. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. If that's the case, and human society, Genesis 9, has the responsibility to curb the violent excesses of human beings, including capital punishment. So we're to prevent murder. Like, if you follow my track here, human societies, one of their primary functions is to stop murder. Governments, one of the most evil things someone can do is take the life of another human being. If a government has that basic function, and we are saying that the unborn is a human being, what does that say for the role of a government on the issue of abortion? Ought the government to allow for the taking of an innocent human life?
No.
No. Yeah. So it all comes down to how you define the unborn. And if you define it as a human being, an innocent life, then as a Christian, you would be compelled by Scripture to say, oh yeah, the government actually has a duty to protect that unborn life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's good, Tim. That's really good. I'm glad you added that. No going around it with the idea of you being personally pro-life, but then saying that the role of the government shouldn't be to stop, to allow for people to have abortions, right? That they need to stop that.
We can understand this. A really simple analogy. I'm personally against theft.
Right.
But I don't think the government has any role in the business.
Someone knows what to do.
We would obviously be like, what? That's crazy.
Right.
Okay, then why? Oh, because human beings have a right to property. They have a right to their stuff. Well, if human beings have a right to that, they have a right to life too, right?
Right.
If the unborn is a human being, well, there we are.
That's good.
Okay.
That's good. Awesome. Good way to close, brother. Good way to close. Yeah, so I think we did a very good job of kind of demonstrating, how the role of the Christian should be in addressing these different issues. And I really like that last example that you gave. So that was really, really good. So hopefully you guys have been enjoying this series, and we'll come back with another episode next time. See you guys then.